In March of 1923, an archaeological expedition deep in the mountains of Ayacucho uncovered a sealed crypt. Inside, they found a collection of documents that bore a name long erased from history: Villacruz. It was the same family that had vanished from Mexico in 1688 after the destruction of their cathedral. The archives revealed something chilling. One brother of the infamous Don Hernando Villacruz had escaped to Peru, carrying with him the most terrifying methods of psychological control that his family had ever developed. For 235 years, those secrets had been preserved, and what happened next in the Peruvian highlands would soon be classified by the government as a matter of state secrecy. But before we uncover how the last Villacruz perfected the dark art of psychological manipulation in Peru, remember, if you've made it this far, you're part of that brave few willing to face the hidden horrors of history. Subscribe and stay close, because what we're about to unearth will change the way you see the past forever. Now, let us journey into the mountains of Peru to discover where the bloodline of the Villacruz found its final refuge. To understand the magnitude of what took place in 1923, we must go back 35 years earlier, to one night in 1688 in San Miguel de los Remedios, Mexico, the night when a 16-year-old boy escaped the unspeakable horror that was about to consume his family. Few know that Don Hernando Villacruz had a younger brother, Rodrigo Villacruz. In 1685, Rodrigo had been sent to Lima to establish trade routes between New Spain and the Viceroyalty of Peru. He was only 3 years younger than Hernando, and though he possessed the same keen business mind, he also shared the family's most dangerous trait, an unquenchable thirst for power. When Rodrigo began receiving letters from his brother describing spiritual experiments being conducted in Mexico, he immediately understood their true nature. But instead of being horrified, he saw opportunity. If Hernando had found ways to control and manipulate entire populations through religious terror and chemical compounds derived from local plants, then those same methods could be adapted and perfected using the rich herbal traditions of the Peruvian Andes. Rodrigo established his base of operations in Lima. But he also maintained vast estates in the mountains of Ayacucho, places where indigenous communities still guarded ancient knowledge about plants and rituals, knowledge that he intended to exploit for his own ends. Unlike his brother, who had chosen the path of ostentation and grandeur by building a cathedral, Rodrigo preferred the shadows. He quietly built a secret network of collaborators that included merchants, corrupt colonial officials, and local healers who could be bribed or intimidated into cooperation. When news reached him of the cathedral's collapse and Hernando's death in 1688, Rodrigo was not surprised. In fact, he had already foreseen this outcome. He had preserved copies of every letter his brother ever sent. He meticulously documented Hernando's rituals and chemical formulas, and had already begun training his own children in what he called the arts of absolute persuasion. But Rodrigo was far more cunning than his brother. He understood that Hernando's downfall had been caused by his arrogance, by drawing too much attention to himself. So instead of grand constructions and public ceremonies, Rodrigo developed a system that was invisible to authorities, yet devastatingly effective. He infiltrated existing religious institutions, monasteries, convents, even small missions lost in the mountains, corrupting priests and nuns who slowly became unwilling agents of his experiments. By 1690, Rodrigo Villacruz had created what could only be described as a sophisticated criminal organization, one that spread across much of southern Peru. His methods were so subtle that most victims never even realized they were being manipulated. He used a combination of Andean plant extracts, some that induced vivid hallucinations, others that heightened suggestibility, mixed with psychological conditioning refined through years of experimentation. His children, raised within this twisted environment, became masters of manipulation. They could instill religious terror, blind fanaticism, or total obedience within entire communities, all without their victims understanding what was happening to them. Rodrigo had learned from his brother's mistakes. He wasn't interested in worship or divine adoration. He sought pure temporal power, and he had discovered that the best way to achieve it was to make people believe they were witnessing divine or demonic miracles, when in truth they were merely being drugged and controlled through careful, calculated means. For over 30 years, the Villacruz organization operated in Peru like a shadow within the colonial system. They influenced political decisions, controlled trade routes, and silently eliminated anyone who posed a threat. All the while, they kept detailed records, preserving every formula, every psychological technique, every manipulation tactic for the next generation. When Rodrigo died in 1720, his sons inherited not only his wealth, but also his entire network and his patience. They understood that true power didn't come from fame or fear, but from invisibility and persistence. By 1723, the third generation of Peruvian Villacruz decided it was time to expand. They had refined their techniques for decades, accumulated great wealth, and identified new remote mountain communities where they could operate with complete impunity. Centuries later, in March of 1923, an archaeological expedition would uncover what Rodrigo had built. But that expedition was no accident. The so-called archaeological mission of March 1923 was only the first step in a plan that had been in development for over 2 years. On March 15th, 1923, Don Sebastián Villacruz, great-grandson of Rodrigo, arrived in the small mountain village of San Jose de Ticlas, accompanied by a team that officially claimed to be investigating pre-Incan ruins reported by local mule drivers. The group included archaeologists from the University of San Marcos, specialized workers from Lima, and several consultants in indigenous traditions, who were, in truth, trained agents in the manipulation techniques perfected by the Villacruz bloodline. San Jose de Ticlas was the perfect setting for Sebastián's experiment. A small Quechua community of barely 300 inhabitants, isolated from main trade routes by days of travel through treacherous mountain paths. The village had a small but ancient church built atop what had once been an Incan ceremonial site. Its people practiced a fascinating blend of colonial Christianity and ancestral Andean rituals, including the ritual use of plants that produced altered states of consciousness. Sebastián had studied the community's reports for months before choosing it. He called it the final experiment. His goal was simple and horrifying: to test whether the methods his family had developed over centuries could be applied not just to individuals or small groups, but to an entire community, turning it into a living laboratory for social control. 3 days after the expedition's arrival, excavation began. From the start, it was clear they had found something extraordinary. The site contained not only pre-Incan ruins, but also colonial structures built atop them and mysteriously abandoned. But the most intriguing discovery was a sealed crypt, one that contained documents Sebastián immediately recognized. They were copies of his great-grandfather Rodrigo's archives, including letters exchanged with Hernando back in Mexico. The very presence of those documents, hidden in a sealed crypt in the mountains of Peru, proved that Rodrigo had created multiple secret locations to preserve his family's knowledge. And these archives contained even more advanced formulas, stronger mind control compounds, more refined psychological techniques, and what appear to be plans for establishing a network that would stretch across all of South America. The discovery electrified Sebastián. He realized that his ancestors had been far more ambitious than he had ever imagined, and that now he had access to knowledge that could elevate his own experiments to entirely new levels. That very night, during a grand banquet celebrating the discovery, with the whole expedition and several village leaders in attendance, Sebastián quietly initiated the first phase of his experiment, the Banquet of Illusions. That night, beneath the flickering glow of lanterns and the rhythmic hum of Quechua chants, Sebastián Villacruz hosted what he called a celebration of discovery. It was no ordinary celebration. The food and drinks served that night had been carefully infused with chemical extracts, potent substances refined by generations of the Villacruz family. They produced a strange mix of euphoria, heightened suggestibility, and an overwhelming sense of spiritual connection. The results were immediate and astonishing. One by one, the guests began to experience what they believed were divine visions. Some saw radiant figures of saints speaking directly to them. Others felt a profound, ecstatic union with God. Several claimed to see the spirits of their Incan ancestors bathed in golden light. But these visions weren't random. They were guided, shaped by Sebastián and his agents, who had taken antidotes beforehand and orchestrated every word, gesture, and tone of the evening. Through subtle suggestions and pre-planned cues, they led each guest into a collective narrative, a shared hallucination in which Sebastián himself emerged as a kind of chosen prophet, and his expedition as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. Among those affected were the community's two most influential men. Father Eugenio Vargas, the 60-year-old priest who had served remote parishes all his life, reported seeing a vision of the Virgin Mary commanding him to fully support Sebastián's mission. And the town's mayor, Abelino Quispe, claimed to see the spirit of the Inca Capac Yupanqui, ordering him to give all of the village's resources to Sebastián's holy work. By the end of the night, the leadership of San José de Ticlas had been transformed, not through persuasion or faith, but through chemical manipulation. The entire community, without realizing it, had fallen under Sebastián's psychological spell. Children of control. But what happened next was far more sinister. Sebastián had noticed that children were particularly sensitive to the plant-based compounds his family used. He also discovered that, with the right conditioning, they could become perfect instruments of influence within their own homes. In the weeks following the banquet, he began inviting the village children to what he described as educational sessions, lessons in history and archaeology. In reality, these were intense conditioning programs. The children were given controlled doses of hallucinogens while being shown images and told stories designed to rewire their perception of reality. They were trained to see Sebastián as an absolute authority figure, almost divine, and to report any conversation at home that hinted at doubt or disobedience. Within a month, Sebastián had turned the children of San José de Ticlas into a domestic spy network. They whispered everything they heard, unknowingly helping him identify and neutralize potential opposition before it could take root. One woman, Maria Quispe, began to suspect something was wrong. Her family's strange visions, her son's eerie devotion to Sebastián, none of it felt right. One night, she confided her doubts to her sister, not realizing that her own 8-year-old son had been programmed to report such conversations. The next day, Maria was invited to what Sebastián called a special blessing ceremony at the excavation site. There, she was administered an overwhelming dose of hallucinogenic compounds. She fell into a catatonic state that lasted 3 days. When she finally awoke, Maria was completely changed. Her skepticism had vanished. She became one of Sebastian's most devoted followers, passionately preaching about the divine revelations she had received during her mystical trance. What had actually happened was far more disturbing. Sebastian had combined dissociative drugs with hypnotic suggestion, breaking down her psychological defenses and reprogramming her mind to serve his will. Her transformation became the template for dealing with anyone who resisted his control. By the end of 3 months, San Jose de Ticlas had been completely transformed into a community of psychological slaves, worshipping Sebastian Villacruz as a divine being. And yet, this was only the beginning. Circles of control. Over the following 6 months, San Jose de Ticlas became a living laboratory. Sebastian pushed his family's techniques further than ever before. Using the documents he had discovered in the crypt, he designed a system he called the concentric circles of control. The outer circle consisted of most of the villagers, kept in a state of blissful obedience through regular doses of mild hallucinogens that induced feelings of spiritual harmony and loyalty. They continued their daily routines, unaware that their ability to question or resist had been chemically erased. The middle circle was made up of about 50 individuals chosen for their manipulative or violent tendencies. They received advanced training in the Villacruz methods, learning how to prepare and administer the mind control compounds, how to extract confession through psychological torture, and how to perform what Sebastian termed silent elimination, killing in ways that appeared accidental or natural. Finally, the inner circle contained a dozen individuals who had resisted the drugs but had been broken mentally through extreme conditioning. These were Sebastian's personal lieutenants, utterly loyal, utterly dependent, and sustained through a mixture of terror and addiction. The church becomes the lab. The old village church, once a place of faith, had become Sebastian's operational center. He secretly modified its structure, adding underground chambers that connected to pre-Incan tunnels. There, he refined his drugs and developed new formulas. Father Vargas, now completely under his control, began integrating these substances into weekly mass, so that every villager received a maintenance dose every Sunday. But Sebastian's ambitions didn't stop at one village. He wanted to expand, to test how far his control could reach without revealing his presence. His most ingenious method involved itinerant merchants, traveling traders who unknowingly carried goods treated with long-lasting versions of the Villacruz compounds. These tainted items subtly altered the psychology of entire populations in neighboring communities, preparing them for influence. Once a village had been sufficiently prepared, Sebastian would send disguised agents, posing as religious pilgrims, healers, or minor officials, to identify and condition its leaders. By November of 1923, Sebastian Villacruz controlled 12 villages across 100 kilometers. His network had grown to include more than 200 active agents, influencing the lives of over 3,000 people. But it was during this rapid expansion that Sebastian made the mistake that would lead to his downfall. The inspector arrives. On November 20th, 1923, one of Sebastian's traveling merchants arrived in the town of Santa Rosa de Ocopa, unaware that his visit would mark the beginning of the end for the Villacruz network. There, by sheer coincidence, resided Inspector Miguel Cervantes, a provincial investigator sent by the central government to look into reports of tax irregularities in the region. Cervantes was a meticulous man, sharp, methodical, and known for his ability to uncover corruption in the most discreet of places. But what he began to notice in Santa Rosa de Ocopa was unlike anything he had ever seen. The townspeople behaved strangely. There was an unnatural calm in their demeanor, an almost dreamlike obedience toward local authorities. Certain topics seemed impossible for them to discuss, as if some invisible wall silenced them. And in their eyes, Cervantes saw something that unsettled him deeply, a glassy, detached stare as though their minds were half asleep. At first, he suspected mass poisoning or an epidemic of hysteria. But as he expanded his investigation, he discovered the same patterns in several neighboring communities. All of them had recently been visited by the same kind of merchants and traveling pilgrims. Cervantes, who had studied psychology during his time in Lima, recognized the signs of manipulation, but he couldn't explain how it was being done. Still, one thing was clear. Something deliberate was happening, and it was spreading. Following the trail of the traveling traders, he traced the source of the disturbance to the mountains near San Jose de Ticlas and to the mysterious archaeological expedition led by a man named Don Sebastián Villacruz. The village of the enchanted. When Cervantes arrived in San Jose de Ticlas on December 15, 1923, he immediately realized that this place was the epicenter of it all. The villagers moved and spoke as though in a trance. Their smiles were serene, their gestures slow, their eyes wide with a kind of artificial peace. It was as if the entire town lived inside a dream, one that never ended. They were clearly under the influence of something, but what terrified Cervantes most was that their condition did not fade. No known drug could maintain such effects for so long. Worse still, whenever he tried to ask questions about the expedition or events before Sebastián's arrival, the villagers became vague and inconsistent, as if their memories had been erased or rewritten. Cervantes began keeping a detailed diary of his observations, a document that would later become one of the most chilling records in Peruvian history. The children, he wrote, seem particularly affected. They move in groups, whispering among themselves, but when an adult approaches, they instantly adopt expressions of innocence, too perfect to be real. Some of them carry small amulets, and when I ask about them, both the children and their parents respond with memorized phrases, empty and rehearsed. During Sunday Mass, Father Vargas uses incense that burns with a thick, reddish smoke. The congregation enters a collective trance, their pupils dilate, and they sway as though intoxicated. Even after the service, they remain dazed, smiling faintly as if still under the spell. I've tried to question them about life before the expedition, but it's as though those memories no longer exist. Either they've been erased or replaced. By then, Cervantes understood that what he was witnessing went far beyond corruption or superstition. He was seeing systematic psychological control applied to an entire community, something that had taken years of experimentation to perfect. But he needed proof, concrete evidence. So he decided to go undercover. The infiltration, disguised as a textile merchant from Huancayo, Cervantes began moving between the affected towns, asking questions, observing patterns, and mapping the invisible network Sebastián had built. Throughout January of 1924, his notes grew darker. He discovered that Sebastián had created what was effectively a state within a state, with its own hierarchy, its own communication system, and its own rules of obedience. Most alarming of all, Cervantes realized that Sebastián wasn't working alone. His agents had infiltrated local administrations, parishes, and trade routes, even reaching as far as Huancavelica and Apurimac. Messages between them were carried by unknowing couriers, mule drivers, traders, even pilgrims. They transported coded information without realizing it. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Cervantes managed to infiltrate one of Sebastián's secret training sessions, held in an underground chamber beneath the church of San Jose de Ticlas, connected to the pre-Incan tunnels. Posing as a new recruit, He entered with a group of locals selected for advanced instruction. What he witnessed that night confirmed his worst fears. The school of subversion. The chamber resembled a twisted classroom. Dozens of Sebastian's agents sat listening as he lectured with calm precision, explaining how to manipulate entire populations. He taught them how to identify weak minds, how to exploit faith, fear, and desire. He demonstrated the preparation of the control compounds, the methods of infiltration into government and church institutions, and the techniques of silent elimination. Assassinations made to look like accidents. But perhaps the most chilling part of the session was the ideology that underpinned it all. Sebastian wasn't just running a criminal organization. He was preaching a philosophy, a vision of a new social order. The natural state of the world, he told his students, is that a few superior individuals must guide the ignorant masses. Democracy, religion, and freedom are illusions that produce chaos. What we are building here is evolution, a perfect society governed by scientific control over the human mind. His words were delivered with the calm conviction of a prophet, and his followers listened with fanatical devotion, believing they were part of something divine, a mission to reshape humanity. Cervantes realized, horrified, that this was more than crime. It was the seed of a psychological revolution, one that could destabilize entire nations if left unchecked. In his notes, he wrote, "The Villacruz agents have refined their methods beyond imagination. They identify authority figures prone to greed or blackmail, then gradually entrap them, step by step, until they become assets of the organization, believing all along that they are acting of their own free will. Children are used as messengers and instruments of influence within families. Through subtle conditioning, they shape their parents' beliefs and decisions, without anyone realizing it. The substances they use create not only immediate obedience, but psychological dependency. It is as if they have invented an addiction to submission itself." By February 1924, Cervantes had gathered enough evidence to realize that he was facing something that threatened the stability of the entire nation. He prepared a detailed report to send to Lima, but before he could deliver it, he discovered that Sebastian's network was even wider than he'd feared. His report never reached the capital, and soon Cervantes realized he was being watched. On February 15th, 1924, a message reached him through the mayor of Santa Rosa de Ocopa. It was a formal invitation from Don Sebastian Villacruz, requesting a private meeting. But Cervantes understood immediately this was not an invitation. It was a summons. His cover had been blown, and he was being called to face the man behind it all, the master of control himself. The confrontation in the crypt. On the night of February 18th, 1924, deep beneath the church of San Jose de Ticlas, the hunter and the hunted finally came face to face. The crypt, once a tomb of ancient knowledge, had been transformed into a chamber of power. Old manuscripts lined the walls like relics, lit by the trembling glow of oil lamps. Around the edges of the room stood Sebastian's most trusted agents, silent, watchful, waiting. Inspector Miguel Cervantes entered calmly, accompanied only by one man, his supposed business partner, who was in reality Sergeant Major Carlos Mendoza, a veteran soldier discreetly sent from Lima to provide protection. Sebastian greeted him with a cold, courteous smile. "Inspector Cervantes," he said, voice smooth as glass. "Or should I say, Senior Merchant of Textiles? I must congratulate you. My men have been monitoring you for weeks. Your methods are impressive." Cervantes didn't flinch. "Senor Villacruz," he replied evenly, "I appreciate your hospitality, and I must admit, I find your operations educational. That single sentence, the deliberate admission of his true identity, caught Sebastian off guard. But instead of ordering his immediate execution, Sebastian's ego took control. He couldn't resist the temptation to show off his genius to a representative of the very system he sought to replace. He began to pace slowly around the chamber, speaking with the tone of a teacher lecturing a dull student. "Inspector," he said, "you represent everything that's wrong with traditional power. Governments built on ignorance, authorities that rule through brute force and superstition. What I have built here proves there is a better way, a scientific order, where human behavior itself is governed and perfected." For the next 2 hours, Sebastian revealed everything. He explained in precise detail how his organization worked, how the drugs were prepared, how the psychological conditioning was applied, how his network extended across Peru. Cervantes listened silently, memorizing every word, using the mnemonic training he had learned during his intelligence service. Then came the revelation that would change everything. Pride swelling in his voice, Sebastian said, "The brilliance of my system lies in its dependency. Every agent requires regular supplies of our control compounds to remain effective. And these substances can only be produced here, in this laboratory, using plants that grow exclusively in this region. Without them, my agents lose their influence within weeks." Cervantes instantly understood the implication. If he could destroy or seize this single facility, the entire Villacruz network would collapse. But Sebastian continued, unknowingly exposing even more of his weaknesses. "Each agent is conditioned to report through specific channels," he said. "If communication is cut off for more than 2 weeks, they activate emergency protocols, destroying evidence and scattering to prearranged locations. My organization is, as you would say, foolproof." Cervantes felt a chill. In that moment, he knew precisely how to dismantle the Villacruz empire, and how to do it without mass casualties. Then Sebastian made his final mistake. He smiled, almost warmly, and said, "Of course, Inspector, all this information will die with you. I've enjoyed our conversation, but I cannot allow you to return to Lima with what you've learned." He raised his hand. His guards stepped forward, but before they could act, Cervantes calmly reached into his coat and produced a folded letter, sealed with the insignia of the Peruvian government. "Señor Villacruz," he said steadily, "before you proceed, you should know every word of our conversation has been recorded by observation teams positioned around this facility. If I fail to return to my rendezvous point in precisely—" He checked his watch. 45 minutes. "Those teams will release full documentation of your operations to the military and to the international press." Sebastian froze. "You're lying," he whispered, though his voice trembled. Without breaking eye contact, Cervantes turned slightly. "Sergeant Mendoza," he said. "Show him the signal." Mendoza took a small mirror from his pocket and angled it toward a narrow shaft in the ceiling, reflecting sunlight from outside in a coded pattern. A moment later, from multiple points beyond the crypt, flashes of light answered. Brief, sharp, unmistakable. Sebastian's confidence shattered. The color drained from his face as realization sank in. He had been completely outmaneuvered. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I want," said Cervantes, "your full cooperation in dismantling your organization in a way that minimizes harm to the people you've enslaved. And I want every piece of information that will allow us to undo what you've done." Sebastian's expression hardened. "And if I refuse?" Cervantes allowed himself a faint, humorless smile. "Then, Señor Villacruz, you will discover that the Peruvian government has its own methods of persuasion. They may not be as elegant as yours, but they are remarkably effective. The room fell silent. The tension so heavy it seemed to bend the air itself. And then, slowly, Sebastian lowered his gaze. "You win, Inspector," he muttered. "But you destroy more than you understand." The collapse of the Villacruz network. What followed in that underground crypt was one of the most extraordinary negotiations in the history of Peruvian intelligence. For 6 long hours, Sebastian Villacruz, confronted with the undeniable reality that his empire had been exposed, began to cooperate. He provided detailed maps of his operations, names of agents, and the methods required to dismantle his network safely. But his cooperation came with conditions, and those conditions revealed just how distorted his sense of morality had become. "You don't understand what you're destroying," Sebastian told Cervantes. "What I have built here is not merely a criminal enterprise. It is proof of a new civilization. Without my system, these people will return to chaos, poverty, and suffering. I brought them order." Cervantes had anticipated such justification. "Senor Villacruz," he replied coldly, "what you call order is simply slavery dressed as benevolence. You haven't elevated them. You've reduced them to automatons." Sebastian's voice rose, filled with something between fury and conviction. "And what do you prefer, Inspector? Chaotic democracy? Corrupt governments that exploit the poor while preaching freedom? At least under my control there is no pain, no conflict, no uncertainty." It became clear that Sebastian truly believed he had created a superior form of society. He wasn't just a criminal. He was an ideologue, a man convinced that domination was salvation. After a long pause, Cervantes made a calculated offer. "Very well. You will cooperate fully in dismantling your organization and rehabilitating the people you've harmed. In return, you'll be treated as a political prisoner, not as a common criminal. Your methods will be studied safely by specialists, so their dangers can never be repeated." Sebastian hesitated, his mind working furiously. "And my agents?" he asked. "Those who acted under manipulation will receive treatment and rehabilitation," said Cervantes. "Those who committed crimes willingly will face justice, but with consideration for how they were recruited." Sebastian nodded slowly. "And the documents of my family?" "They'll be secured by the state," said Cervantes. "The dangerous ones sealed away. The rest will be preserved as historical records, so that the world may understand and never repeat." At last, Sebastian whispered, "I accept your terms, Inspector, but what you are about to witness will change your understanding of power forever." The reawakening. Over the next 72 hours, Cervantes personally supervised the dismantling of the Villacruz operation. Sebastian not only provided information, but also demonstrated the preparation of the control compounds and the psychological methods used to enslave entire populations. He even assisted in developing antidotes to reverse the effects of the drugs. The recovery of the villagers was slow and haunting. In San Jose de Ticlas and the other affected towns, people began to wake up as the chemicals left their systems. At first came confusion, then horror. Memories returned, broken, distorted, painful. For many, the realization of what had been done to them caused deep trauma. Medical teams from Lima arrived to provide specialized psychological care. Maria Quispe, the woman once reprogrammed to worship Sebastian, went through 3 days of disorientation before her true memories returned. "It was like living in a dream I couldn't wake from," she later told Cervantes. "I remembered my family, my life, but it was as if everything was behind a veil. And there was always this voice whispering that I was better this way, happier this way." The children, who had been used as spies in their own homes, required delicate rehabilitation. They carried unbearable guilt for having betrayed their families without understanding why. Perhaps the most tragic case was Father Vargas. When he finally understood that he had been administering mind control drugs during Mass, he collapsed in despair. Overcome with guilt, he attempted to take his own life, stopped only by the swift intervention of Cervantes and his team. "I turned my church into an instrument of the devil," the priest confessed during recovery. "I poisoned the souls of my flock with the sacraments of God. How can I ever be forgiven?" His rehabilitation took months, not only of medical treatment, but also spiritual counseling by theologians from Lima, who helped him reconcile his faith with what had been done to him. Meanwhile, Sebastián's agents across the region were systematically neutralized. Once cut off from the central supply of drugs, most of them suffered what Cervantes described as operational collapse. They lost the ability to manipulate others, and, in many cases, were exposed by the very communities they once controlled. By the end of the operation, more than 3,000 people across 26 villages had been liberated. Aftermath: Sebastián Villacruz was taken to Lima under heavy guard. His case was classified under national security secrecy. Official records described the Ayacucho events as disturbances related to contraband and sedition. The true story, the story of a man who enslaved entire communities through psychological control, was hidden from the public. Inspector Miguel Cervantes was promoted to Director of Special Investigations and founded a covert governmental unit dedicated to identifying and dismantling groups that use psychological manipulation to subvert social order. That unit would operate quietly for decades, dealing with what they called psychological subversion. As for Sebastián, he was not treated as an ordinary prisoner. He was kept in a specially built facility, interrogated for 2 years by experts in psychology, criminology, and national security. The interrogations revealed that Sebastián had corresponded with individuals in other South American countries, men interested in what he called scientific social engineering. Though the communications were coded and incomplete, they hinted at a shadow network of experimenters sharing knowledge about psychological control. This discovery prompted the Peruvian government to form secret cooperation agreements with Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and Chile to exchange intelligence on subversive psychological activities. The healing of Tiklos. Meanwhile, the affected communities began their long road to recovery. San Jose de Tiklos was temporarily evacuated while doctors and psychologists worked with every family. Many villagers chose never to return, haunted by the memories of what had happened. Others stayed, determined to rebuild. Among them was Maria Quispe, who became a leader in the reconstruction efforts. Her transformation from victim to survivor inspired others. "What I learned," Maria said in a government interview, "is that the human mind is both more fragile and more powerful than we can imagine. Sebastián controlled our thoughts and emotions, but he never destroyed who we truly were. That part of us survived, waiting to wake up." Father Vargas eventually recovered enough to return to service. Assigned to a parish in Lima, where he founded a ministry dedicated to helping victims of psychological trauma, using his own experience to heal others. The documents found in the crypt were studied by historians and criminologists. They revealed that the Villacruz family had been experimenting with social control for over 6 generations, refining and recording their techniques in secret. The most dangerous records were sealed by the state. The rest were archived for study, not to replicate, but to defend against such methods in the future. Sebastián Villacruz officially died in custody in 1926, reportedly of natural causes. But some unofficial documents suggest he may have succumbed to complications caused by years of exposure to his own chemical creations. Legacy. Miguel Cervantes continued his service until his retirement in 1945. In his private memoirs, discovered after his death in 1963, he wrote extensively about the Villacruz case. What I learned from Sebastián Villacruz was not merely the capacity of mankind for evil, but our capacity for resistance. Those he enslaved were wounded but not destroyed. Something essential in them endured, allowing them to heal and rebuild. Yet I also learned that Sebastián was not unique. The human ability to control and manipulate others is limited only by imagination and resources. Defending against such power requires eternal vigilance and a deep understanding of both our weaknesses and our strengths. The events in Ayacucho set a precedent for how Peru, and later other nations, would handle psychological warfare and mass manipulation in the decades that followed. Cervantes' techniques for identifying and neutralizing such organizations were compiled into manuals later shared across South America, shaping early international protocols for psychological defense. But perhaps the greatest legacy of all came from the people of Tiklos themselves. Over time, the mountains returned to peace. The villages were rebuilt, new traditions were born, and the story of their resistance became part of local folklore, passed down from generation to generation as a warning. They told it not as a tale of horror, but as a testament that even under the darkest manipulation, the human spirit can survive and awaken. The Villacruz family, after more than 2 centuries of existence, ended in the mountains of Peru. But the lessons of their history remain, about the dangers of power, the resilience of the mind, and the unbreakable strength of human will. Because the greatest monsters are never supernatural. They are human, and the battle against them begins within ourselves.